Hello, and today we're going to be looking at a world where Poland was a great power before World War II. For whatever reason, after Versailles, they did better against the Russians. The Lithuanians accepted their integration, and the Western powers simply granted them a little bit more land over in Germany. They also managed to win their war against Czechoslovakia, not only gaining the disputed lands, but also Carpathian Ruthenia, which is populated by Ukrainians. So let's hop right into it. We're going to assume they have a similar, perhaps more democratic government than in our timeline, just to give them that little edge as well. It would probably be more dictatorial than somewhere like the French, the British, the Americans, but it would overall be a democracy. So let's get right into it. First things first, they want to consolidate, and the first place they would do that is up in Latvia, where they would establish a puppet regime. It is now a very small nation, and they can simply do this no problem. Meanwhile, down in Romania, they wouldn't push for a puppet, they would push for an all-out alliance against the Soviets, against the Hungarians, and against the Germans. An Eastern European pact, a between-the-seas alliance. Some might even call it an intermarium. However, someone who wouldn't join this alliance would be the Czechs. Instead, a new Polish-Czech war would start up. The Germans would take advantage of this German-Czech war to annex Austria. This is happening roughly right before World War II. That's where we're picking this up. Meanwhile, the Polish invasion of Czechia is going very well. All of Slovakia has fallen, and even this new, small, fairly easily defendable border is slowly getting pushed back. The Czechs don't have too much foreign aid, as the West would rather work with the Poles, and the Germans, although they would favor the Czechs over the Poles, wouldn't really want to send much help to their enemies anyway. Thus, the Polish would be continuing to make progress into Bohemian lands. The Germans, seeing this, would intervene, as they would want control over the German-populated Sudetenland. And they would gain this, as the Poles would be forced to, perhaps even supported by the Western powers, the Germans would seize the Sudetenland. This is a very different timeline. The Poles, as I mentioned, are democratic. However, they are also expansionist, and they are extremely nationalist. It would really be quite the interesting government to look at, because it's not quite like anything we've seen before, a nationalist democracy, but if we want this to be a fun timeline, I think that's what we're going to go for, because we want them to expand, and we want the Polish to be strong. Ignore that. That kind of just happens. I have these... I don't know if you want to hear it or not, but I got some buttons on the side of my mouse, and I clicked them, like, way too often on accident. As for the peace treaty, I don't think it's anything that you wouldn't expect from it. Actually, the Poles are going to gain that little piece of land that I gave to Germany initially. As for Slovakia, I could see it being directly integrated. I could see it becoming a puppet. We're going to have some other powers push in to carve out their own lands, as Hungary would seize the south. Hungary and Poland would be on relatively good terms. The only reason they would have bad relations is because of the Polish-Romanian alliance. But Hungary and Poland individually would really not be that bad off, as long as Hungary doesn't invade. As part of the peace treaty and enforced by the Western powers, Czechia would be made neutral, guaranteed by Poland, Germany, and others. However, at this point it would be a Polish puppet. Now, Poland is not in the best situation here. They are surrounded, they are sandwiched between two major powers, both stronger than them, and in this timeline, although Poland is stronger, honestly, they still don't stand much of a chance. However, this stronger Poland would force Germany to wait before declaring war, forcing Stalin to wait as well. Eventually, however, World War II would start, and here I'm going to color the Polish in blue, because we're going to have something interesting happen here, and that is a far more successful Allied effort during World War II. We need the Polish to survive, no matter what means that takes. So the British and the French intervene, but in this timeline we're going to assume one thing that simply wasn't true in ours, and that is that the British and French are going to be far more aggressive, seeing this stronger Poland and ever so slightly weaker Germany, especially as they seized land, but they were not allowed to seize the Czech gold reserves. They were not allowed to seize Czech weapons. Although they gained the Sudetenland, this land is nowhere near as important to them as all of the weapons and money they gained by invading Czechoslovakia in our timeline. So Germany is actually a decent bit weaker here. Looking at the start of the war, however, it's about what you'd expect. The Germans would still immediately start winning, connecting up with East Prussia and pushing up northward into this semi-independent Lithuania. Meanwhile, some Latvians would rise up around Riga, declaring a new Latvian fascist state against the Germans. Meanwhile, down in the south of Czechia, I could see them going either way, but assuming they gain a new government, I think it's more likely they would actually side with the Poles, as Germany may even just outright invade them at some point to consolidate their front. This Germany is still extremely cocky and would really just want to declare war on everyone right away. Their invasion into Poland would continue, however they would be stopped outside of Warsaw as a major Polish counteroffensive would take place. Their push into Lithuania would be far more successful, although they would pay far less attention to it. The Soviets, now finally getting the chance to expand, would declare war on Finland, not quite yet willing to invade Poland. However, they would start eyeing up an alliance with Germany against the Poles, who they are also threatened by. Once again, we're going to have to assume some things here that are simply not true in order to make the scenario more entertaining and make a better timeline for Poland. And one other thing we're going to assume is that the Allies are not just more aggressive here, and that because of Polish Baltic ports, the Allies actually send troops and far more aid to Poland. We're going to assume they fully guarantee Poland, not just against Germany, meaning that if the Soviets invaded the Polish, they wouldn't just suffer more casualties. After a humiliating war in Finland, they would have to fight the Allies, which they really wouldn't want to do. Instead, I see it as likely that they would simply invade Estonia and take what they could get for now, waiting to see if Germany would make more progress in the future. And they would, especially down in the south in Slovakia and Bohemia. They would be taking significant lands. However, the Poles would still be holding around their capital, with the major city of Krakow falling. A major loss, yes, but the Poles are holding out greatly. At this point, it has been months. The German economy is already starting to stagnate, and the French and the British are more prepared than ever. Using their remaining Baltic ports, Allied aid is flooding in, and it's possible Poland would focus a lot of effort on retaking these ports and putting down the Latvian uprising, as this would allow them to receive even more aid. A lot of Polish troops would be in Riga, as that is the main city through which Allied aid would arrive. Meanwhile, the French would do something they never did. In our timeline at the start of the war, there was something called the Phony War, where nothing really happened around here, around the French-German border. Neither side really did anything. In this timeline, the French are going to make an invasion of the Saarland. The Germans have less than 30% of their army here. In this timeline, probably less than 20% of their military. That simply cannot stand up to almost the full strength of France, especially with how much bleeding they're doing in Poland. Thus, the French invasion would be very successful. Although it may look small, the French, who were commonly known as cowardly, would start to feel emboldened by these victories in the Saarland, and would soon take the entirety of the southern Rhine. This would be a major loss, as if the French managed to capture the entirety of the Rhine, that would be a major hit to German industry. Along with that, Italy refuses to join the war, neither does Spain, neither does Hungary, as they all see the war going far, far worse for the Germans. At this point, we may even see some major Polish counteroffensives, as German troops are forced to head west, allowing really quite the pushback. The Soviets are quite the wild card here. I could see them intervening, going to war against the entirety of the Allies, but with Germany doing so badly, I don't think they will. Instead, these Germans, lacking a ton of money, would be forced to retreat from the west bank of the Rhine, and at this point, Italy would honestly be considering joining the Allies more than the Axis to secure their post-war position. Romanian aid would also be there, although it's not really all that important. Hungary would also not even be considering joining the German side. They are on decent terms with the Polish, and although a rivalry with Romania remains, they simply see no reason to join the war. Soon enough, Poland, however, would be forced to compromise with Russia. A Soviet entry could completely flip this war around, thus they would be forced to give up some lands, more specifically in the south around Ukraine, and perhaps most importantly, around the key Soviet city of Minsk, where they would be forced to fall back significantly. They would also be forced to give up on their puppet, however they would be allowed to take and keep the entire city of Riga. This major land loss is necessary. They simply cannot fight a two-front war right now. They are doing pretty well against the Germans, but like I said earlier, a Soviet entry into the war would completely flip this around. So yes, Poland has lost some land in a video about Poland doing well, but don't you worry, they will be gaining that back very, very soon. Meanwhile, the Polish, who their entire army can now head to the German border, as they would trust in the Soviets not to invade them, would manage to recapture Krakow, a very important city, and they would start to push towards Silesian regions, and even spreading out from their capital, securing themselves. It seems that an encirclement opportunity of Königsberg here is very possible. The French at this point would have pushed past the west bank of the Rhine, and would simply be steamrolling into western Germany. The French were cowardly, yes, but at this point the war has gone on for over a year, and the Germans have simply been retreating on this front. Their army is overstretched. It's even possible some more nations would join. The Netherlands, yes, they're neutral, but with enough allied pressure, I could see them joining, not really dedicating much military, but their land would be very valuable. Denmark, I wish they would join, but frankly, I just don't think they would. No matter what the Allies tried, even if the Allies threatened an invasion of Copenhagen, they simply have no reason to join the war. Hungary at this point could even consider joining the Blue Team to secure their position post-war. Meanwhile, the Polish would be performing the most major maneuver of the war, an encirclement of Königsberg. They would push back all around the region and soon reach the coastal city of Danzig, encircling it and with British help navally blockading it, soon capturing it, a major loss to the Germans. The French would have been pushed back slightly in the west as German troops arrive, and the Dutch, well, they would start to regret joining the war, as the Germans would attempt to knock them out. They know they have to get rid of at least one enemy, and they see the Dutch as the weakest and easiest to take, as French aid didn't exactly arrive in large amounts. The French are still as incompetent as ever, even if they have had time to prepare their militaries. However, at this point, it's been easily a year of war, probably a year and a half, maybe even more than that. The German economy is in the gutters. They have no more money, they are running out of weapons, and at this point, after the Allies threaten them, nations like Italy and Sweden, well, maybe not Italy, but nations like Sweden would start to embargo the Germans, hurting their resource situation even further. They are surrounded, overstretched, and they would be falling back on all fronts. Soon enough, Posen would be recaptured, as would southern Poland, as offensives would be started into Germany. The last German push into the Netherlands would happen nearing the city of Amsterdam, but in the Battle of Amsterdam, the Allies would win, pushing them all the way back in the Netherlands, and soon enough the war would be over. I'm not going to go over it day by day, there's no reason to. The French would see a major offensive in the west, perhaps even pushing past the Rhine in the south. Meanwhile, it's very possible that with less years of Nazi occupation, and with far less hope in the Germans to win this war, some sort of Austrian rebellion would happen as well. Combined with Polish, Slovakian, and Romanian troops arriving, Vienna would be captured. At this point, a lot of nations would start to join. It's clear who's going to win, and they would all just want to carry favor with the Allies, including nations like Hungary, who once again you may not expect, but I actually see this as a very smart move on their part, helping the Allies' opinion of them, securing relations with Poland, and although they still don't like Romania, they will be joining the war. Soon enough, this would lead to the fall of a lot of core Austrian lands, and the recapture of a lot of Czech ones. Meanwhile, Silesia would be falling, and I mean, the German front would just be collapsing. They are surrounded. I've mentioned this enough. They would surrender. Looking at a peace treaty, it wouldn't be all that harsh on the Germans, frankly. I mean, the Czechs would for sure, no doubt in my mind, regain all, or at the very least most, of their lost lands. Meanwhile, the Hungarians may gain the Burgenland. It doesn't matter much. We're going to assume here that they do, but it really could go either way. The Czechs, as I mentioned, are reestablished. However, due to the Polish basically single-handedly saving them, they would be put under Polish influence. They wouldn't exactly love this, but, I mean, what could they do, realistically? Slovakia wouldn't expand at all, and Poland would expand up to the Elbe, a gigantic expansion for the Polish, and the Allies would actually be against this. The only reason this happened in our timeline was because the Soviets, I mean, they didn't care. They didn't care about the people living there. They just didn't care. Although in this timeline it is far... Actually, no. You know what? I get I'm going back on what I said here, but this is just too much. Without Soviet interference, this simply wouldn't happen. Instead, we're going to see a slightly smaller Polish expansion into Silesia. Still a beautiful territory to take, along with all of East Prussia. A great expansion, yes, but not nearly as harsh as what I just mentioned. If you didn't know, the only reason that happened is because the Soviets didn't care. They just went in there, took all the East Germans, and deported them, essentially, from their homes they had lived in for hundreds of years. They just got rid of them because they wanted somewhere to send Polish people, and they didn't care. The Allies would care a lot more, and they would not allow the Poles to do this. As for the rest of Germany, I could honestly see it being divided in half, similar to what the British plan was after the war. Without a Soviet force, and with the Poles being semi-reasonable in their division, not exactly demanding an occupation zone, we would see the split of Germany into South and North, the South quite possibly being united with Austria. As for the French, seeing as they actually performed well in this war, they're going to directly annex the Saarland, a very valuable territory for them. And as much as I hate to help the French and hurt the Germans here, they would also at the very least temporarily gain an occupation zone of the Rhine. With this, we can decolor all of the countries that we don't really care about here because they're not that related to Poland. That is one of two major enemies dealt with, leaving just one that had taken land from them, one they didn't really like much. You know what? Yeah, let's keep Poland blue, because they're going to be our good guy. And their alliance is currently Romania, and under their influence, Slovakia and Czechia. Quite the nice little sphere they've got here. They have a lot of they have a lot of influence over Germany, and they would be getting war reparations from the Germans, both north and south. Without having to worry about the Western Front, they would divert all their attention to the east. They would establish an alliance with Finland, and quite possibly some other minor countries, but for now, just Finland. And the war we all knew would end off this video would begin. The Soviet Union versus Poland, Finland, and Romania. Poland can't win this. They don't stand a goddamn chance. They don't have a chance of beating the Soviets here. Yes, they're strong. Yes, the Soviets are struggling. But they're not going to win this. If anything, the Soviets will be the ones to declare war on the Poles as soon as Allied guarantees go away, assuming they do go away after the German war. But frankly, we need the Polish to win, which is why we're going to be changing a few things. And yeah, the British decide, yeah, let's help them out. And at this point, the Americans would be becoming more and more against communism as well. Without fascism being a problem, and with it being about 1941 at this point, soon Japan, I couldn't tell you what Japan does. The British didn't really have to worry about Europe as much, so it's very possible Japan never strikes south. And you know what? I think I just got an idea for something that will make this video very interesting. After the Russian invasion, and with the Allies fully strengthened in the south, in Indonesia, etc., the Japanese really need somewhere else to expand. If you don't know, in real life there were two Japanese doctrines: strike south, strike north. South into the resource-rich islands from the west, north into Siberia and to get their resources. Striking south was a much better idea, but here, the Japanese are going to go north. Now, for this, we need the Japanese to do better overall, maybe make them a bit less fascist. We're just going to change some stuff overall. They'd likely still be at war with China, which kind of makes this a drag in the long term for the Poles, but in the short term, this would be absolutely amazing for them, as the Japanese would provide a major distraction over in the West. In this timeline, now being at war with the Soviets instead of with the Allies, and having never seized French Indochina, the Japanese would actually be in a far better position, as trade with the US could very well still be an option. In fact, they don't even really need the resources. They're in such a better position due to no US embargo and no war against the US. It's absurd. But their offensive into eastern Russia would be a major success, at least initially. They would push swiftly into the important parts of Siberia and start a push along the Trans-Siberian Railway, eventually being stopped by a small Russian garrison. Meanwhile, over in the west, Polish resistance would continue, as the Poles would start to rile up resistance within the Soviet Union itself, not just from Polish people, but also from Ukrainians, Belarusians, Estonians, practically anyone who doesn't like the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviets may be able to get some help here, and I want to expand this war. So joining the Soviet side is Bulgaria, after a communist coup overthrows the nation. Now, don't ask me how this happens, but in real life they had moderate support for communism, and like I said, this video is just for fun, just to make things entertaining. But due to this, Yugoslavia would decide to fully join the Polish alliance, actually ending up making this not so great of a decision for the Russians, as the Yugoslavs would quickly push into Bulgaria, who still had military restrictions at this point. And soon as maybe one of the more unrealistic parts, but something that is crucial if we want the Polish to win, and that is Turkey joining the war. Now, in real life, they didn't even join World War II for quite a while there, until the very end, just to join the League of Nations. Here, they're going to be joining up with the Polish alliance, forming truly a large Eastern Bloc and just an anti-Soviet bloc. They would be gaining an insane amount of support from the UK, France, especially from the US. The US would be sending them Lend-Lease. It's even possible the US gets more involved and sends volunteers into Poland, as, once again, without fascism, communism becomes their largest threat. It becomes what the American people fear, similar to how it did during the Cold War. The Japanese invasion, meanwhile, would have stopped. The Japanese don't hold the advantages here. They are still running out of resources, despite trade with the US. In fact, it's even possible that without any intentions to strike south, and if the Japanese play their cards right, they could have good relations with the US and even Lend-Lease from the US to help them out, which they were in dire need of while fighting in China. We're also going to assume that they do a bit better in China. The communists and the nationalists don't work together. A second civil war starts, whatever you want to call it. The Japanese are simply in a much better position against an even weaker China, and they continue to make progress into there as well. Now, we are finally in a position where Poland can start to win. Bulgaria capitulates, and instead of the great ally they had hoped for, the Turks have now captured Azerbaijan. In a surprise move and with help from the locals, they crushed the nation. We would also see Iran join, as at this point the Soviets would have occupied the north of the nation, stating it was for national protection. But with Turkey joining, the Iranians would decide they simply don't have to take this anymore, and they would reinvade their own lands. This would prove that, the Soviet doctrine of just invading everyone, it ain't really working out for them. Instead, they would now be falling back in Central Asia. Now, I keep relating this to real life just to make the video, not more realistic, just more interesting. But the Soviets and the Americans did split Iran in order to lend-lease them during World War II, while the Germans were invading them in Operation Barbarossa. Here, for whatever reason, they decide to invade northern Iran as well, perhaps to overthrow the government, install communists, for whatever reason, but this ends up backfiring greatly. The Soviets are now fighting on an even bigger front line, and the Poles are making counteroffensives. In the north, with the support of the Estonian people, they would push greatly. Similarly, in the south, with the support of the Ukrainian people, they would start an offensive into their old lands. The Soviets here, just assume whenever anything seems unrealistic, some famous general died, some crazy event happened, maybe a meteor crashed into Stalin's office. Whatever you want to think, I just want to make this entertaining, so let's wrap it up. The Poles would eventually push the Soviets out completely, starting major offensives into Soviet lands together with the Romanians and the Yugoslavians, pushing all the way up to the major river. The Turks, meanwhile, would have made a teensy bit more progress, almost pushing past the Caucasus completely, and in case you care, Turkmenistan also would have fallen. Now with American Lend-Lease, the more democratic than in real life Japanese government would also be making progress along the Trans-Siberian Railway. Another major loss for the Russians, as, they really aren't getting any help here. Another reason they did better in the war was American Lend-Lease of things like trucks. They would get none of that here. Instead, they would get sanctioned by all of the Western powers, and most likely blockaded in the east by the Japanese, and in the north by British ships who would directly blockade Russia without fully joining the war. Soon enough here, we are going to see the end of it though, as the Poles can't exactly hope to reach Moscow. That is unrealistic. That would simply never happen, and in the east, despite the constant back and forth, the Soviets are the ones pushing back overall, and they would have the overall advantage. Thus, the war would soon end. The Finns can't exactly capture Leningrad, no matter what they try, no matter how good their casualty ratio is, and the war would soon end. I'm going to ignore the war in China for now. Japan can continue that, and it's quite possible Japan eventually wins that, which would change this world in so many ways. But for now, let's just look at what is happening to Poland. First things first, they would be forced to give some lands to the Romanians for their participation in the war. They may expand down slightly in Bulgaria, while the Yugoslavians would also seize some major Bulgarian lands. The Turks, in fact, may even seize some Bulgarian coast, really hurting the nation. Over in the west, Azerbaijan could go either way, but personally, I think it should and will be going to Turkey, who initially conquered it and will be keeping it here. Meanwhile, Georgia would be given independence and expanded all the way up to the Caspian Sea as a buffer between the Soviets and the Turks. Down in the south, the Iranians would simply gain a major amount of land along the border, not exactly making up for the devastation of their capital and their entire north, but still nice, right? Still quite nice. Why are these blue colors different? Oh, right. Because these are allied countries, not actually Polish. Georgia would also become a Polish ally, as this major anti-Soviet alliance would probably last for quite a while. These nations don't have too many conflicting claims, and it could turn into a sort of Eastern European Union. Although it is quite possible nations like Iran leave, Turkey could very well stay, Turkey could go, but Romania and Yugoslavia would for sure stay aligned with the Polish. No doubt in my mind. As for Bulgaria, it would simply be put under their influence, probably under some sort of puppet government, maybe Polish, maybe Romanian, maybe Yugoslavian. Could go either way, really. Now that we finally... Oh, no, we haven't dealt with their allies. Let's look at Finland, who would gain major land expansion all across the border. Not quite taking the entire peninsula, but for sure still very nice, just to make them a little bit fatter there, a little chunkier. They would take a nice strip all across the border. They would also very well remain a Polish ally. Now finally, for the most important of all, Polish expansion, which would be significant, especially into Ukraine and down into Latvia. They would push up to and past the river, and depending on which area you're looking at, while an enlarged Estonia would also be created under Polish guidance. It would actually be turned into a Polish ally, not a puppet state, sort of as a favor for everything they had done. At this point, Poland would start to push for unification with some of these eastern nations, or closer ties, open borders, etc. But they would be in a very good position. As I mentioned, Iran would leave. We can ignore these Russian lands as they would remain a major enemy, but with this massive alliance against them, it really doesn't matter. I'm also going to ignore the East, as this isn't a Japanese video, it is a Polish one. Yeah, I did that, didn't I? Yep, the Japanese can go. They'll probably end up winning in China, especially with these new resources, and with the war in the north ending, allowing for an even larger border with a weaker China. Once again, not going to talk about that much more. We are here to look at this beauty. I'm going to take Poland. They've occupied Slovakia for long enough. They can unite with them. At this point, they have not just reunited, but they have pushed past the borders of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. They haven't quite reached the Black Sea, but their alliance stretches far, and they are stronger than they have been for a very, very long time, having defeated both their western and eastern rivals. Or not even rivals, their western and eastern destroyers, fighters, I don't know, competitors, whatever word you want to use for it. Germany and Russia are crushed. Poland is great. I really hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye.